I'm Marshall, an independent researcher, and I thought it was marvelous the way you've summed up the crisis. The amount of work is tremendous. But the question that I have to ask is, first of all, what have you learned? I mean, this happened on your watch. I mean, IFPRI has been giving us projections on the world's food situation, and in a sense, you were blindsided. And so the question really is, what have you learned? And what I see is, in your prescriptions, is very much more the same, with the exception of perhaps the emergency support for small farmers. And I really question that because, I mean, really over the last 30 years, what has happened is there's been a series of policies that have been pursued which have resulted in an increasingly small number of net food exporting countries, and increasing reliance on an ungoverned and ungovernable international food regime which has failed us. So I'm really wondering what your reaction is. Have we done anything wrong over all these years? What have you learned? Thank you.
I would like to draw on my colleagues in a moment. Let me just add one aspect of what have we learned, what is different to the 1970s crisis. I think it became very clear as this price crisis unfolds that we live in a multipolar world compared to 1975, where we lived in a bipolar world. In 1975, 456, it required Henry Kissinger to call the World Food Conference, and a few carefully considered coordinated actions to calm the markets, and in order to be better prepared, to also call for foundation of IFPRI in that context, and things happened. Well, how did things happen this time? Who responded first to IFPRI's and others' alerts? It was in China and India. So much closer where the action was. The Indian government, the Indian Prime Minister, the Chinese top leadership responded last year fall, when this was nowhere on the agenda in Brussels, Washington, Berlin, or Rome, except in circles of experts. I think it's a very important lesson. I think it gives you two lessons. One is the analytical capacity, the capacity to respond also in budgetary terms and in policy terms, is strengthened in the large developing country players. Mark, you may like to comment on what went wrong, Tom's remark.
Yeah, I don't think you can argue that we were blindsided. As Joachim pointed out, we were calling as early as 3 years ago that this kind of situation was developing. Obviously, we didn't predict the biofuels would blow up as big as they did prior to the early warning signs in the early 2000s. I think you could criticize us that we didn't get our message across strong enough, but I think what we found is that in the international circles in particular, as Joachim said, that the action tends not to take place based on early warning, but only when the crisis actually hits people in the face, and so that's where I guess you could say we fell a bit short. So it was really, you could see the long-term fundamentals changing in a negative way, but then I think what people didn't see is how tight, agricultural markets, as you pointed out, internationally tend to be very thin in many of the key commodities, and so once things go bad, they go bad very quickly and have very, very strong impacts.
Jonathan Cook from World Wildlife Fund. I wonder if I could ask two brief questions. The first one is about the issue of trade. In your remarks at the beginning, you pointed out that completing the WTO round would be fine if it were the right WTO round, but the comments later did not really specify what that would be. And I'm particularly curious what it would be, given that there's still quite a lot of disagreement over actually what benefits for many of the poor countries would actually be obtained from the current package in Doha. That would be one question. The second one is on the issue of small farmers. You hear these days quite a few responses to the whole food crisis saying that the future of world agriculture has to be large-scale production. I'm thinking of someone like Paul Collier, who's been quoted a lot in the papers lately on this issue. For those of us who actually do care about the world's small farmers, we're obviously looking for ways to combat that, I think, rather mistaken assertion, and I'm curious what the panelists would say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maximo, would you talk about trade? Feel free to call in colleagues in the audience, and Mark then on the small farmer issue.
Yep. I have several colleagues, specialists on trade, so David Orden is around and Antoine Bouet, I think. But let me just mention something. I think that the argument that we are pushing towards the WTO is to try to trade to work with competitive basis, to avoid subsidies and to avoid support prices behind. So if we are able to let the markets compete freely and are able to push towards a WTO that will release these distortions to the market, that's what will get the maximum benefits for developing and developed countries. I don't know, David, if you want to add something, or David Laborde or David Orden. David, yeah.
So yeah, David Orden from IFPRI. I think it's a fair comment that there's very little the WTO can do in the short run that's going to address the immediate increase in prices that we have. And so it's more an issue of the longer term, as Maximo points out, what kind of food system we're going to have. And I think we would argue that having an open trading system for agriculture that countries can count on, including, as was mentioned, lower tariffs and lower trade barriers as a long-run guaranteed set of policies as opposed to at the discretion of individual countries, creates a situation where there's more confidence in the agricultural system, more investment can take place in it, and the flows of products can occur that are going to be needed. We're not going to always have perfect balances within each region or country between supply and demand for food. So one dimension of a successful world food system is going to be a more open world system. It's not the only necessary dimension, but it's one important dimension. And just to respond to the first comment, at least to put on the table an idea, I think we have to be a little careful in assuming from this current crisis that the world food system is failing us. Since World War II, real world agricultural prices have been falling steadily, and there have been only 2 incidents in 60 years where the world has faced a situation of sharply rising world prices. Now, 2 is more than we'd like to have, but I think we need to carefully, at this context, address it, but not address it in ways that are going to undermine what has been overall a successful and can be pushed to be more successful world food system.
Thank you. David Laborde, you wanted to add something?
Thank you. David Laborde from IFPRI. So I would like to make quickly three comments. First, why the Doha rounds will be concluded quickly? It's to ensure trust in the cooperative system of the world governance. And it's very important because beyond the crisis we are right now, it's a problem of cooperation, coordination. And the WTO is one of the institutions that works, and it's important that it continue to work. The second comment is, during a long time, in particular the World Bank has said that agricultural liberalization will increase agricultural prices and it will be good for poor. But we know, the model has said in the past, and we know now that increase in agricultural prices is not good for all the poor people on earth. So the WTO liberalization, the reduction in subsidy will increase on the long term agricultural prices. But you have to put side program at the same time. Cutting tariffs and cutting subsidies is not enough to have a development round. And my third comment is about export ban and export taxes. Right now in the WTO, export bans are banned. Countries will not choose export ban on every product, just for sovereign security reason. And export taxes can be used and are not bound. So a first step maybe in this round, without having too many issues, is just to say, okay, export taxes can be used, but you start to bound them, like you have bound tariffs in the past. And why export bans are banned but still used is mainly because the political economy of the WTO is not designed to fight export ban. We are in a mercantilist point of view, so everyone wants to export, in theory, and not import. So you are initially going to cut tariffs, to bound your tariffs, And if one country starts to play against the rule, you are going to punish him by imposing tariffs. And at home, you have lobbies that will be happy to impose tariffs on foreign exports. But in the case of export ban, all this system cannot work. So it's try to find a new mechanism for punishing bad players at the WTO. If one country starts to put export ban, it will harm, in general, LDCs or other poor countries, and these countries are not able to defend themselves. So the reaction should be a common reaction. So we have to design at WTO a global punishment system, but this will take more time. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Mark, we have this question on small farmers.
No, I think we would agree fully with that comment that it's the productivity growth for small farmers is really the backbone of both the fast impact programs and the longer term investment that we stressed investments in seed, fertilizer, and credit, for example, for small farmers that are and technologies that are scale neutral that can equally be taken up by small farmers as well as large farmers. It's been interesting, even in Asia, where many people 20 years ago were predicting a considerable concentration of farm size. In fact, there's been, a continued decline in average farm size, and there may be ways to structure the economy that gets better efficiency gains out of that. But whatever they are, they will involve small farmers in contractual mechanisms, for example, vertical integration and so forth. So it's absolutely essential that we do maintain a focus on the small farm sector.
Yeah, I would add that we have two little comparative studies between Africa and Latin America. But if you do a casual comparison, Latin America agriculture growth rates do not favorably compare with African growth rates in the last few years. If we go one step further, small farm agriculture in East Asia certainly was outperforming for several decades agriculture growth rates of large-scale agriculture in Latin America. So the evidence base for Tom Collier is not very strong, that the economies of scale in agriculture matter a lot.
Bruce White with Catholic Relief Services. Mark, you didn't mention anything about land tenure, and I guess on this same issue, in terms of how can you really boost agricultural production without actually addressing this issue?
The comments are based on a findings meeting in which I participated a few weeks ago in Rome about access to seed in local seed markets, based on several empirical case studies that we have conducted here at IFPRI. It seems to me that the weight of the evidence is that a Green Revolution type package will have limited impact in most of sub-Saharan Africa, which is, I think, why, Mark, you used the word key. But Joachim opened talking about inequality, and so large numbers of rural people will be left out of that program. Many of those are farmers who are net consumers. Prices will rise for them dramatically, and in some cases, they will have incentives to consume their seed. So access to seed does not necessarily mean access to modern varieties. There could be a set of measures aimed at local seed markets, and for one particular reason that's very important for Africa, and that is the extreme environmental heterogeneity and genotype by environment interaction. And similarly, improved access to seed does not mean necessarily seed that is brought in.
Thank you. Bob Berg, World Federation of United Nations Associations. I wonder if you could give us your view of what the receptivity to this more comprehensive approach is in the multilateral system and among key players you've talked with, and maybe even a hint of what you think is going to be necessary to market this kind of package.
This is Seema Jalan from Women Thrive. One of the hardest hit groups by the food crisis has been women. But at the same time, a lot of reports have pointed to the fact that investing in the capacity of women farmers is really one of the key ways to stem the current crisis and also to prevent further crises. If the panelists could please speak to how this has been integrated into short-term and also long-term strategies.
John, would you like to start with the last one, impact of the food price crisis on women, and to do about that?
Yeah, I think the question itself was actually focusing on women as producers as opposed to women as consumers or women as primary caregivers. And I think the point to observe here is that is part of the longer-term package we're proposing. There's a real need for a whole series of measures which improve productivity. In countries where women are active in agriculture, which would in large part include much of sub-Saharan Africa, there are important questions around land rights and access to land, which would be integral to those packages, which are going to be needed in order to increase productivity.
Could I ask Ruth Meinzendick, who is chairing some of our work on women and gender, to add a comment?
Thank you. I do. Certainly, it's not just land rights that are important. It's very critical that the seed be targeted to women farmers, that the fertilizer, for example, if vouchers are given, that those be given to women farmers, not just to the male presumed heads of households. This is going to be a critical part of all of this. In the productivity part, also in the cash transfers, targeting women with the means to purchase food in the short run is also going to be really critical to buffer the effects of this, because we do know from a lot of research that often in consumption also women put themselves last in the household, and that has repercussions for the intergenerational transmission of poverty.
Just to further concur, the land rights and not only land rights but water rights as well is essential to effective implementation of many of these programs. I just missed it. Yeah, thanks.
You ask about the reception of the multilaterals.
Uh-huh.
I think that one thing that we can learn from this crisis is how the need to be prepared for these types of crises. So multilaterals are responding and trying to respond, although as you can see the responses are not so fast as we would like to have them, because the prices are already increasing, countries are being affected, and they're trying to move as fast as they can. But so there needs to be a mechanism in place to get fast responses, therefore, and that we can especially gain an opportunity from the responses, like we were talking about targeting to women. So we know a lot of those things. So these types of quick responses could help to integrate them into the system by targeting the programs to them.
Bob Burke's question was, what's the receptivity for a comprehensive action program in the various decision-making communities? Actually, I'm quite optimistic. From what I see is emerging as an agenda for the G8+5 meeting, and that issue is on the agenda. Currently, I understand during the lunch break of all time slots in the upcoming G8 meeting in Japan. And it comes across as a more and more sophisticated agenda. The meeting in which I participated with the British Prime Minister, it was a fairly sophisticated debate for 2 hours. What I see emerging as a debate here in Washington or in Berlin, where the cabinet also has formed a committee to prepare for action plan, has become multifaceted. Whether we are overdoing it with 8 action items, I sometimes wonder, but I keep arguing a complex thing you cannot address with a few silver bullets. If you look at the U.S. President's program for the emergency action, it has also become multifaceted. It's not just food aid. It also has an investment component. I would have wished that component would have been bigger, and the food aid component would have more cash, but I think it's going very much in the right direction. So Lastly, last week there was a UN Economic and Social Committee Council meeting at the UN on the food price crisis. So all nations there, 600 people in the room. Again, a fairly sophisticated debate, including the component which we have not touched upon today, that is national security. The implications of undermining livelihoods for people's willingness to be violent because there are no other options for them, or because they see this as a way to change political systems. So that component you will see we don't have explicitly formulated in the IFPRI action program, but it is there, we recognize it, we speak to it.